So Ronnie has been a vegan and a campaigner for animal liberation for almost 50 years. In the early 70s, he was one of the founders of the Animal Liberation Front, and he served 3 prison sentences, a total of about 9 years in prison, for animal liberation activism. Since his last release from prison in 1982, he's been involved in various animal protection campaigns and political activities, and his main focus is now on vegan outreach and the creation of a network of local activist groups to spread the vegan message. So over to you, Ronnie.
Hi, well, thanks so much, Will, and it's great to be speaking at this conference. And I was so interested to listen to the presentations by Richard and Laura, and it's great to be following them with this talk. Now, the road to animal liberation, I think before we talk about the road to animal liberation, we need to really need to define, I suppose, what animal liberation actually means. And for me, at least, animal liberation means the creation of a widespread situation where other animals throughout the world are no longer oppressed and exploited by humans. That's what animal liberation means to me. And the road to that, well, when did we set forth on that road? Well, the term animal liberation, I think really arose in the 1970s, and I think probably arose in the UK and then rapidly spread to the rest of the world. I mean, there was a book called Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, philosophical book, but then of course many other philosophers have used the term, many other activists, and also the concept of animal rights really arose in the 1970s as well. The idea of speciesism that was coined in the 1970s by Professor Richard Ryder, for instance, and this was the time when all this the movement for animal liberation, animal rights really sprang up. But I think people had been working for animal liberation before that. I think there'd been people opposed to the oppression of other animals probably for centuries and centuries. It's just that they probably didn't actually think of it in terms of animal liberation as such. So that's really when the idea began in the 1970s. And before that, there'd been organizations campaigning to protect animals, but they didn't really have the idea of animal liberation. Their campaigns were really more against cruelty and against specific aspects of the oppression of other animals. And there were people campaigning against circuses and zoos and hunting, for instance, animal experiments and all those things. But by and large, the people who ran the organizations, people involved in those organizations weren't vegan. I mean, they by and large weren't even vegetarian. And so the rise of veganism really dates back to the 1970s as well. And more people became vegan. People took on board the concept of animal rights, and they became vegan, and the whole movement began to grow in the 1970s. And so, and that's also when the Animal Liberation Front sprang up, and I was very proud to have been one of the founders of the Animal Liberation Front. And the ALF was really responsible for the sparing of a large number of animals from suffering and slaughter, and mainly, I mean, my main knowledge is about the UK, and here in the UK, the main success of the Animal Liberation Front was against the fur trade and against the animal experimentation. I mean, the fur trade was pretty much decimated by the ALF. The ALF began a concerted campaign against businesses selling fur. And that began in the 1980s, And it resulted in a situation where it ended up with hardly any high street businesses selling fur. And we now have a situation where there's only one store, only one big department store in the UK that has a fur department, and that's Harrods in London. And the only place where you find actual fur shops, fur stores on the street, that's in London as well, and only in one part of London. So, and whereas these things were at one time were all over the place. And so that was a big success of the ALF. The other success was against animal experimentation. When the ALF campaign began in the mid-70s, the number of animal experiments every year in the UK was well over 6 million. And as a result, really, of the ALF campaign, that was reduced to around about 3 million. So that was a reduction year on year of 3 million experiments on animals, which added up to a huge number. And so all in all, the Animal Liberation Front was responsible for the sparing of many millions, tens of millions of animals from suffering and slaughter. And obviously, I feel proud to have been involved in that. But there was a sense in which the Animal Liberation Front could never actually achieve animal liberation. And the reason for that is that if we want to achieve animal liberation, we're not going to do that while the vast majority of people don't believe in it, while the vast majority of people are still speciesists, are still human supremacists in their outlook. Unless we change that, we're never going to achieve animal liberation. The problem with the Animal Liberation Front was that there was no dialogue with ordinary people. There was no dialogue with the public. The ALF's campaign was directly aimed at the industries of animal oppression, trying to force them out of business. And to some extent, it was successful. But there's a limit to how far that can go and how far it could go. And so unless we educate a large number of people to believe in animal liberation and to be opposed to speciesism, we're never actually going to achieve animal liberation. And I believe that the way that we need to do that is through vegan education. And we need to remember that vegan education is really quite a recent thing on the road to animal liberation, because what happened going back to the 1970s was that there was this big upsurge in animal rights activity, animal liberation activity, and a lot of people becoming vegan. But nobody really was involved in promoting veganism. All these new vegans that came into being, all these people that became vegan, a large number of them became activists. But those people became active against the fur trade, against animal experimentation, against hunting, and all these things. And a lot of these organisations that had previously been run by meat eaters were now run by vegans. But they were all campaigning on all these other issues, and nobody was campaigning for veganism. And campaigning for veganism, I mean, in the UK and then I suppose throughout the rest of the world, really only began about 25 years ago, when people started holding vegan festivals and doing street outreach and those things. That only began. That's only recently in the history of the animal liberation movement. That's really only quite a recent occurrence. And it's great that that's happened. It's great that that's started. But if we are going to achieve animal liberation, that's got to get a lot more. We've got to have a lot more vegan outreach, a lot more vegan education, because of course veganism is a philosophy of animal liberation. Veganism is a philosophy that's opposed to speciesism and human supremacism. It isn't just about diet. It isn't just about food. But obviously food's a very important part of it, because for ordinary people, for most ordinary people, the main way that they buy into the oppression of other animals is through the food they eat. So educating people to adopt a vegan diet as a starter, I think, is a very good tactic. And then they can be educated about other aspects of veganism, because I think a really big aspect of veganism and animal liberation, for instance, that's kind of only fairly recently come to the fore, and I think for many years was ignored by the movement, was the oppression, or is the oppression, of other animals caused by adverse human impact on the environment. I mean, we have a situation where billions of animals are dying because of the climate crisis, and then we have pollution, we have overconsumption, overproduction, overpopulation, human overpopulation, all these things that contribute to the harmful impact that our species has on other animals. And to me, that's very much a vegan and an animal liberation issue. And I think that is now becoming more to the fore in the campaigns that we operate. So what we need is a lot more vegan education, and we need that vegan education everywhere. And at the moment, what tends to happen is vegan outreach seems to mainly occur in the centres of big cities. People go into the centre of big cities, maybe from the surrounding area, and they'll do some kind of activism in the city. Maybe do a stall or do something involving showing videos, those type of things, to educate people to go vegan, and that's great. It's great people are doing that, but what about all the other places, all the suburbs of the big cities, the smaller cities, the towns? In a lot of these places, there's no vegan activism, there's no vegan education going on. And if we're really going to spread the message, that has to change. And we've got to get vegan education right down to the grassroots in all of these places. And then so how do we do that? And the only way that we can do that is if more vegan activists actually become organisers. I mean, we obviously need more vegans to become activists, and one big difference now, where things are different now than they were in the 1970s and the 1980s, was in those days, if someone was a vegan, they were almost certainly an activist. Veganism and activism seemed to go very much hand in hand in those days, and nowadays they don't. And we have a far greater number of people who are vegans, or at least people who consume a vegan diet and consider themselves vegan, shall we say. A much greater number of those people, but a much smaller percentage of those people are activists these days. And that really has to change. We have got to get a lot more people being activists to spread the vegan message. But I think perhaps more important than that, we need more vegans to become organisers, because unless somebody organises an action, it doesn't take place. And what we need is a lot more organisers of vegan outreach in local areas, in smaller cities, in smaller towns, in the suburbs of cities. We need people to get together, local vegan activist groups, and to carry out vegan outreach. And that needn't be a huge number of people. You're not going to get the same number of people in a small town as you do in the centre of a big city. But you don't necessarily need a large number of people if you have a small group of people who are committed and who are persistent in their activism. And really, that's what we need to do if we're going to go forward on this road to animal liberation. Then and we're going to follow that road, to the end, and when we achieve, what we're fighting for. We obviously need more vegans to become activists, but we need, and anyone listening to this who isn't vegan, if that's the case, then please do become vegan. And if you're a vegan, become an activist. But if you're a vegan activist, please become an organizer, and become an organizer of vegan outreach in your own area, so that we can spread the vegan message everywhere. And I believe if enough people do that, we can eventually achieve animal liberation. Well, thanks very much. That's my talk. I hope I've been quick enough to allow a lot of time for questions. And it'd be great if there's a few questions from people.
Thanks for that, Ronnie. So if so that's a really interesting talk as well, and it's fantastic to get your insight from the early days of the ALF to today. So that was really interesting. So thanks. So if anyone's got any questions, I know it's quite an odd format because we're not all together, we're not in a room, we can't put our hands up. But if anyone's got any questions, do you want to type them in the box? Richard, do you want to come in with a question?
Yeah, if that's all right. Thanks, Will. Ronnie, love the talk. It's really nice to see you again and to hear and to be inspired by the thoughts you put out there. My question is really the relationship between online sort of social media forms of activism and on the ground sort of campaigns, because obviously from the late 90s to the present day, the rise of the internet and social media and so on. I just wondered what your thoughts were on the relationship maybe between some of these different sort of forms of activism.
Well, I think social media can be a double-edged sword. I think in there are a lot of ways in which it can it can complement activism. I mean, when we were kind of trying to organise stuff, back in the day, it would be by telephone, and we'd have things like telephone trees where one person would phone another and they'd phone two people, and it would go on. And this is how things would be organised, or newsletters that went round, but you had to plan events well in advance for people to be informed by the newsletter and that kind of thing. And sometimes it seems incredible that so much went on when the communication was so much more difficult than it is today. And these days, there are things like Facebook events, for instance, where people can be invited to take part in things. And so I think social media can contribute to activism in that way. And I think also social media itself can be a form of activism. I mean, one thing that our local vegan group has been doing because of COVID, and we haven't been able to get out and do the outside activism, we looked into and started advertising on social media. I mean, specifically on Facebook and Instagram, and these are paid adverts. And obviously, it's not. I don't like giving money to Mark Zuckerberg, but you have to kind of look at the overall, the pros and cons of what's to be gained by that. These are video ads, short video ads, which seem to be the best way of attracting attention. And we've caused thousands of people to go to vegan websites through these adverts. This is local because you can specifically target the adverts to the local area, and that's what we've done. And really, it's been so successful that even when we've been able to go out and about like we were 2 or 3 years ago, we're still going to carry on with the adverts because they're really good complement to the outside activities. So social media can be used in that way to spread the message, and as I said, it can be used to organise events. But I think there's a downside to it where people think that that's all they have to do. Somebody puts something on their like on their Facebook, puts a horrific image of an animal being slaughtered, and thinks, so that's great, I've done my activism. When really what tends to happen is most of those that person, most of their friends are probably vegan anyway. And so you're preaching to converted. It doesn't break. We have to break out of the vegan bubble with these things. And I think social media can lead people to thinking that they're achieving something when they're not really. So I think activism out in the real world is still really important.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. Thanks.
Right. So we've got a couple of questions coming in on the chat. So we've got one from Nathan. He says, Ronnie, you focus on the ALF, but how is what you said related to the ELF, which is the Earth Liberation Front? Are there similar issues regarding veganism and public outreach with the ELF?
Well, yes. I mean, there are great similarities between the two organisations, and I think, yeah, you see kind of at the end of the day, as I say, but like with veganism, for instance, there's this big focus on food, but I think veganism is a lot more than food, and people talk about my journey to veganism, and that kind of seems a little bit strange to me because because to me, veganism is a philosophy. It's a philosophy of animal liberation, of opposition to speciesism. And I would say once someone accepts that philosophy, once somebody says, I believe in that philosophy, I agree with that philosophy, that is when that person becomes vegan. And then the other part of being vegan is thinking, how can I live according to that? How can I do my best to live according to that? And that can be a learning process. And that is a journey within veganism. In other words, like, the idea of the alternatives to meat and these and dairy, and a lot of these are produced by huge meat companies. I mean, Frank Bentos have brought out a vegan pie, haven't they? And a lot of the plant milk is now being produced by dairy companies, for instance. So you're still buying into these, not very pleasant businesses. You see, but a person can start off on their journey within veganism that they'll kind of buy all that stuff, but they then can be educated to say, well, look, it's actually more ethical all round to try to buy stuff from a vegan company and try to, as much as possible, avoid supermarkets. So that education kind of continues within veganism. And I think that's a bit the same with environmental things, that obviously, the harm done to the environment has by humans has a huge negative impact on other animals. And within veganism, people can be educated to kind of to reduce their impact on the environment. The other thing is the political aspect, because becoming vegan, like properly vegan in terms of the overall philosophy, can change the way people think and act politically, and that can change the political landscape so that things become better for animals, indeed all life on Earth through that. And I think that's the kind of I think where the ELF has prevented harm being done to the environment, where projects have been damaged and things have been stopped through their activity, that's great, and that's similar to what the ALF did. But I think it's the same again, that once again, and unless there's a huge amount of public education, we're not actually going to achieve we're not going to achieve liberation in any way without that.
Okay, I've got a question that's come in from Natalie. She says, 3 really great talks, thank you. So that's great. She says, question for Ronnie. Local organising and community building is key, but what are your thoughts on social movement organising, and in particular mass civil disobedience? We've seen recently actions of Extinction Rebellion and Animal Rebellion. Do you think this is a quicker route towards centering animal oppression in public discourse?
I think it's a complementary route. I think the two things, those two things are complementary. I think I think it's great that Animal Rebellion are doing what they're doing. I think it's great that Extinction Rebellion are doing what they're doing. And obviously, the more people we can turn vegan, that's the more recruits for those organisations that can go and join in and do that. I think that the difficulty they have is they're kind of up against political ideologies that are fundamentally opposed to what they're asking. And so they're trying to move. I mean, there's a history of kind of protests, certainly in the UK, of mass protests that's failed. I mean, we had, going back really just a bit before my time, we had the CND who opposed to nuclear weapons, and the Committee of 100 who were their direct action wing. And they were kind of somewhat similar to what Extinction Rebellion are doing today. And they sadly failed in their aim of getting rid of nuclear weapons. Because the ideology of the government was so much opposed to what they wanted that whatever they did wouldn't move the government on that. Now we may be a bit different to that with climate breakdown, because I think there's even greater concern about that. And so this is the problem, that you kind of have to. These organisations are kind of hammering away at this brick wall that's very, very sturdy and resistant to them. And so we have to find a way of weakening that brick wall. And so if more people become vegan and we can change the political landscape, at least we can get voted in, say, politicians that were more sympathetic to veganism, more sympathetic to to combating the climate crisis, then that brick wall would be easier to knock down. So I think those two things are complementary in that sense.
Right, and we've got one from Dana, who says that ALF were very dominant throughout the 80s and 90s. Maybe due to legal restrictions, it seems that the animal protection movement turned to different underground tactics, such as undercover investigations. What is your perspective on that development?
Yeah, I think there's various reasons why the ALF went in. I mean, the ALF is active. And I think, strangely, I mean, the ALF in the early days was kind of most active in the UK than anywhere else. But I think that's changed now. I think there's probably some countries now where the ALF is still active in the UK, but it's very small. And I think there's other countries where it's probably more active now. I think there's various reasons why the ALF went into decline in that sense. I think there was like, there was, you know, the police formed special squads to combat the ALF. It took a while to catch up. It took a while for them to catch on to what the ALF were doing, how the ALF were operating. So we had kind of had a head start, but they caught up in the end. So that there was more police concentration on arresting people. There was much more surveillance, including the use of police infiltrators. There were much heavier prison sentences. New laws were brought in, and old laws were kind of twisted so that they could be used against activists, particularly anti-vivisection activists. And I think there was a general change in because of sort of the rise of neoliberalism, really, and the kind of the increase of people encouraged to become selfish in their attitudes. And this kind of goes back to the Margaret Thatcher government in this country. There's been a kind of change amongst young people, I think, because in those days, almost everyone who was an animal rights activist was involved in the ALF. We were all very young. You know, we were all in like teens and 20s, and you know, it was only very occasionally you had anyone older than that. Whereas now you look at the people who are kind of activists in organisations, their kind of age demographic tends to be a lot older. And I think there's, and there are some young, you know, people involved, but I think there's been you know, that's another contributing factor. And then, particularly in the UK, you know, we have closed circuit cameras everywhere. They can track, and even on the roads, they can track a car from one end of the country to the other. So it's so much more difficult to do direct action, to do the type of direct action that you want to get away with. If you want to do direct action, like everyone goes into a farm, we have these. An organisation called Meet the Victims, where they go into farms and they go openly in there to expose the conditions, but they're not trying to hide, they're not trying to get away. And of course what they're doing isn't nearly as serious in terms of, you know, the type of sentences they might get as ALF actions. So direct actions change. People no longer try to not be caught because they know that the chances of not being caught are like really slim. And yes, there's been more undercover stuff done. A lot more people are doing undercover surveillance now, and that is probably as a result of people looking at other ways of campaigning.
We've got a question from Laura. Laura, do you want to come on and ask that question?
Oh, hold on. Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great talk, super interesting. So yeah, my question is, I often hear old school animal liberationists and animal rights activists complaining about how the term vegan has replaced the terms animal liberationist, animal rights activist, and in so doing has played a major role in weakening the animal rights movement and turning veganism into a diet. And I agree with that point, but I also feel like the term veganism has an important role as something that is an essential part of animal liberation, but also is pivotal to human health, human social justice, ending, you know, movements of oppression in human society. And ecology, although I will say that ecology also considered to be an animal rights issue because they have a right to their habitats and we don't have a right to take that from them, but ecology for us as well. So my question is, what do you think about the idea of having the vegan movement and the animal rights or animal liberation movements as two movements that are obviously deeply intertwined, but also kind of distinct from each other and not interchangeable, so that the vegan movement is its own thing that is, of course, an essential part of animal rights, but also has other aspects to it. And the animal rights movement, I mean, you know, of course, if you define veganism in the true sense, then they should be interchangeable. But you know, the way that people are looking at veganism today, it's not panning out that way. So, what do you think about kind of having them as intertwined movements, but also distinct?
Well, I think yes. I think the problem is that people don't understand what veganism really means, because veganism really does mean animal liberation. If you look at the intentions of the founders of veganism, the people that coined that word, they were animal liberationists. They might not have used the word animal liberation, but if you read what they wrote, they were. And so what's happened is veganism has become like thought of by a lot of people as just being a diet. And I think it's important to counter that. I think it's important to kind of say to people, no, it's not. That's wrong. It isn't a diet. Because vegan food isn't the same as calling food vegan isn't the same as calling a person vegan. Those are two different things. But I think the words, because in a sense, there's a tactical aspect to it as well as when you use vegan and when you use animal liberation. Because I think if you're wanting to spread the message, then it's often easier to use the word veganism. For instance, locally, our vegan group is an animal liberation group. We've totally an animal liberation. But if we're going to say, maybe wanting to do an information stall at an event, you know, our name is vegans. See, if we called ourselves animal liberation, we wouldn't get the stall, you see, because they go, oh no, what are these people going to do? They're going to bring a bomb in here or something, you know. And because the vegan, you see, really veganism is just about animal liberation. It isn't kind of the vegan diet has kind of health benefits, for instance, but really veganism about animal liberation is not like about human health, even though that's, if you see what I mean. The vegan diet is, but veganism itself is a philosophy of animal liberation. But you can use the fact that the vegan diet is well, proper vegan diet, healthy vegan diet is good for human health. You can use the fact that you know, animal farming is harmful to the environment, for instance, as a way of being able to be at place can spread the vegan message. In other words, we do stalls at local health events, we do stalls at local environmental events, we do stalls at local animal rescue events, because all these things have a kind of connection to certainly with, you know, with the environment and with health. They certainly have a connection to the vegan diet. So we're able to kind of get into those places. But when we're in there, we will give people information about the kind of animal liberation that equates veganism with animal liberation. But in order to get in there, it's better to use the word vegan as a description of our group. So I think that's the thing. I think it's kind of easier to, but all the time I'm trying to say to people, look, veganism is animal liberation, and that's what it is. It's not just, you might have thought it was a diet and that's how you come into it, but it's actually much more than that. And that's kind of a way of kind of moving people along that ethical path.
Great, thanks, Ronnie. So unless any other questions come in, then I will I'll ask the last question, which is you've been involved for nearly 50 years now in the animal liberation movement, and there's obviously been a lot of changes in that time. But if you were to get your crystal ball out and think in another 50 years' time, which is 2071, where do you think we'll be then? Where do you see the animal liberation movement in 50 years' time?
I think it all depends. I think it all depends on how many, how many vegans we can get spreading the vegan message, which in turn kind of depends on how. I mean, there's a lot that people could do on their own. I mean, people don't have to be necessarily a member of a group to spread the vegan message. People kind of, deliver leaflets to people's homes or give them out in the street or leave them in public places. And, there's lots of things people could do if they don't want to be part of a group. They prefer to operate on their own. But in a group, you can achieve a lot more. And I think the idea of kind of community groups, you see, one thing that tends to happen with vegan outreach is I kind of sort of refer to it as hit and run. What happens is all these people go into the middle of a big city, they do an event, bang, and then they're gone. They're not part of that community, you see. Whereas if you've got a vegan group in a suburb of a city or in a town, say for instance, you can become more integrated within that community. You can kind of get involved with other groups. You can get involved with the local environmental movement. You can get involved with social justice groups, and help those people and become involved and share events with them and becoming part of that community and that enables you to get the vegan message right down to grassroots level. And I see a lot of vegan activists not doing that. I see a lot of vegan groups not doing that. It's very much on the surface. They operate very much on the surface of society. And I think you've kind of got to go down, more into society in terms of like on a local level to really properly spread the message. And so I think if we can have enough of that, I think it all depends on how many vegans get active and how much outreach we can do. And I hope that if that happens, then we might be really a long way ahead by that time.